All right. Well, I know last week I said week 7. This is actually week 7. That was week 6. I apologize. I got my weeks mixed up. We're about halfway through the semester, so that's not an uncommon thing. We've just got so much going on. I've got 2 big research projects that'll be starting here pretty soon. So I'll get into those details here in the next couple weeks as we get that started. So for my update for this week, it was kind of an interesting week. A few transitionary things that we were learning and studying. So I want to start today off by talking about my interfaith class. In my interfaith class, we are still reading a book called The Bridging Differences Playbook. It's a really good book. If you Google it, I'm sure you can find it online in PDF and download it. It's a fun book to read about how can we bridge differences with other people? How can we work together? We may agree to disagree, but how can we be amicable and work together on these issues? So this week we talked more about interpersonal instead of intrapersonal. So not just what can I do to help conflicts within myself. This is learning what can we do to deal with conflicts with other people, whether you and another person, whether you're facilitating or mediating between 2 people. So the skills we talked about were really important. I think these are good, important skills for everyday life for us to have. So the first one was listen with compassion. Make sure we are taking the time to listen with compassion. Because that doesn't mean listen to find fault with other people. That does not mean listen to find a way to argue your point against another person. You're not trying to listen to win an argument. You're trying to listen to understand the other person's perspective. Listening with compassion is realizing maybe they have valid points that I need to understand. Take the time to accept their ideas as well as yours, okay? That's an important point that we should be working on. Another one we talked about, and it's phrased here, put people before politics. But really what it comes down to is, as our professor talked about in class, that the idea is we oftentimes take these identities or roles on ourselves, and politics is a very easy one to say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I'm an independent, I'm a conservative, I'm a liberal, or whatever. We can put ourselves into a category, and then we categorize the people around us. The problem is oftentimes those categories prevent us from truly understanding each other. So let's get rid of those categories and see each other as equals, as people, as humans, as fellow inhabitants of earth, as children of God. See each other as equals. And that will help us in understanding each other's perspective and what are the good points that each other's trying to portray, basically. So that's an important, good starting point. Just see each other as equal. When you get into a discussion with somebody, don't just go, oh, they're liberal, so I don't have to believe them or listen to them. Or, oh, they're conservative, they don't know what they're talking about. Look at them and go, they're a valid human being. If I want them to respect my perspective, then I need to respect their perspective. I mean, that's the whole do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. You know, we're getting back to the Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount, all the stuff I needed to know I learned in kindergarten type ideas here. But it's important, and we don't do this enough. Now, the next one was perspective taking and giving. So when we talk about perspective taking and giving, it's learning us, how can we look at the world from somebody else's point of view. Also is how can we help them see the world from a different point of view as well. So there's a give and take in there. There's a willingness for me to look at where they're coming from and help them to see where I'm coming from. So look at those different perspectives. We learn truth by taking what we currently believe and this new idea and evaluating them equally. If you put them on equal platform and are equally willing to accept and reject them, then you'll start to find the truth between them and among them. That's what we have to do. It's easier to just say what I believe is right and what you believe is wrong. That is the easy default way to think. It takes critical thinking. It takes more maturity emotionally to evaluate these things. But when you do, it's a much better outcome. Much, much better outcome to help you in dealing with things. Gets rid of a lot of the angers and pride and hate and everything else. It allows you to find the truth. Now, the next skill that we learned is find shared identities. So when you're working with somebody, find things that are connecting you together. Our professor, Dr. Ford, had told us some stories he had of working with Israelis and Palestinians. He does a lot of work in the Middle East, helping mediate problems and challenges between Israelis and Palestinians. And he says he'll bring a group of Israeli teenagers in and a group of Israeli Palestinians in, and he'll find out that they both like the same musician. Once they do, they go from that's an Israeli, I hate him, or that's a Palestinian, I hate him, to you like that person too. Isn't that awesome? They start talking about songs, they start singing the songs together. They have this common value between them, and that's this musician's music. When they do that, when they have that common identity, they see each other as more equal. And that helps. If you're in an argument with somebody, find a way to connect on an equal playing field. What is an identity or something that's valued between both of you? Let's build on that to come together more. That'll help out a lot more. That'll make a big difference. Now, another one is understand values. Take time to understand what is important to them. What values do they have? And realize that this is so important for us to look at, okay? You have values. You know you have values. You believe in your values. They're very important. Always remember that they feel the same way. They have values. They believe their values are important. Even if their values are very different than yours, they believe their values are just as valid as yours. You believe your values are just as valid as theirs. Maybe even they believe theirs is more valuable and you believe yours is more valuable. The problem is you both believe your values are the most important. But how can that be? Especially if they seem to be opposing values, how can your values and their values both be equally important? You see, that poses a contradiction. You both believe the same thing, just different perspectives of it. So this is where that coming together helps. Let me look at my values and their values equally. Then we can start to understand where is the good truth between these, where's the commonalities, those kinds of things. That will help a lot in dealing with conflicts and issues and challenges and things like that. Now, another one that they brought up, another skill to use is what they call try self-distancing. Now, this is not the COVID self-distancing, 6-foot rule type stuff, okay? What they're saying here is sometimes you need to get out of your own mindset. Sometimes you need to get out of your perspective. And you need to take on a different perspective, like a neutral third-person perspective of what's going on in the situation. In neurolinguistic programming, we call this triple description. Or this is the idea of disassociating from the experience, taking a third-person neutral perspective to evaluate, is this a good thing or not? And then to adjust it and work with it. So that's the idea of self-distancing, getting out of your own head, out of your own mind, and becoming a more neutral observer. We've all had that experience where we've seen two people argue, and we sit back at the neutral observer and go, this is ridiculous. You guys are like, do you guys not see the solution to this? You have some pettiness, both of you. And it's that third person perspective that adds a whole level of value to the experience. We oftentimes get stuck in our own, and we want to argue our own is right and theirs is wrong, when sometimes that's not true. So this disassociation standpoint of let's take a second perspective, let's take their perspective, let's take a neutral perspective. Gaining these in this triple description idea will help you to better understand your perspective and what needs to be done to help you out. So those are the skills that we talked about and we're learning this week as we're getting into more actually learning how to work with people and do more in mediation type techniques and ideas. So it was really fun to get into. So in my 4990 class, in my religious studies course, we talked a lot this week about the flood of Noah, the problems with Ham and Abraham and all that stuff, and their descendants, basically. So we kind of started with that and then got into the descendants, down into Abraham. And a couple points were brought up that were really interesting. One is, I'd never thought about this before, but if you think about ancient traditions, okay, if you think about what was life like as a New Testament children of Israel person. So like a Jew in Jerusalem or in the New Testament times, or even a Jew in Jerusalem in Old Testament times. Their technologies, their customs and traditions were very the same. Old Testament and New Testament Jews, very the same. So when they talk about their past, they're talking about when the children of Israel was in Egypt, which was different, and even before then, Abraham. So Abraham is the beginning of the modern past of Israel. Before Abraham, if you go back earlier to Abraham, so the rest of Genesis, that is getting into the prehistory of the Jews. Because Abraham was the man that was given the covenant, that his children would be the descendants, and then it was his grandson Jacob, who had the 12 sons and did all that stuff as well. So it was fascinating. I'd never thought about it that prehistory was before Abraham. History was from Abraham on. So there's a transition. Most Jews would understand Abraham's history because it wasn't that much different from their current way of living. But before Abraham, it was wildly different. Because before Abraham, we have Tower of Babel. Remember, there's the flood. We talked about the flood and the curse of Ham and things last week. So this week, it's now the Tower of Babel comes around. They're trying to build this tower, which is kind of a giant ziggurat, if you're familiar with that term from Middle Eastern ideas. Big tower so they can get to heaven. Now, there's a common philosophy that they were building a tower. They believed just on the other side of the clouds was heaven. And if we could build a tower big enough to get on the other side of the clouds, we could go to heaven without following God's plan. And I think that's still possible in the reading to see that idea. But they're building this huge tower. Some people speculate that the reason they're building this huge tower, and it was probably around the area of central Iraq today, kind of south central Iraq today, not far, kind of a bit south from the city of Ur today, down that way. They believe that somewhere in that area, possibly over more into the Iran side of the land, is where they had built this at one point. Some people speculate too on this that because the people were starting to scatter, they were moving out of the area, migrating out. So Nimrod was the king. He established himself as a king at this time. And if people are leaving, that means less people for him to be king over. And so he wanted to rally the people together. So a giant tower would allow people from all over the area to see it and come together. So he tried to use it to unify the people. God didn't like it, struck it down, confounded the languages, and now everybody had to separate out because they couldn't talk to each other. They didn't know how to speak with each other. So a fascinating time in history, lots of crazy stuff. So because, we've got the Tower of Babel, we've got the flood, we have all the destructions and the problems before the flood up to Adam and Eve. Lots of crazy stuff happens. And then things settle down around Abraham and kind of move forward in a more linear fashion after that. So there's kind of a delineation at this point in Genesis where Abraham becomes the real history of the Israelites, and before Abraham is all the prehistory type stuff. I'd never thought about it that way, but it's kind of a cool way to look at it. We did take some time and talk about another ancient document called the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you're not familiar with this, the Epic of Gilgamesh is an ancient Mesopotamian story about a man named Gilgamesh. He was a king of the city of Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia. So we're getting back to like almost Akkadian time frames, really, really ancient times. I think more Sumerian than Akkadian, but that kind of ancient time frames in the world. He decides he teams up with this kind of a god-like person, and I believe it was Enkidu. And I know if you're a Bible scholar, I'm probably slaughtering the story, and I apologize about that. Feel free to correct me in the comments if you'd like. But he and Enkidu go off on this journey looking for more immortality. Gilgamesh wants to be immortal. On the journey, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh comes to face with his own mortality and realizes, I don't want to die. I don't want to go away. I want to be immortal. He runs into a guy named Upnishtali or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. And he says he survived the Great Flood. So Upnishtali is kind of the equivalent of Noah, survives this flood and learns of a flower. If you eat this flower, you gain eternal life. He does this big journey, finally finds this flower to gain immortality, to gain impermanence, basically. He could be king forever. And just before he gets ready to mix up this flour so he can eat it, a snake comes out of the grass, eats the flour, and leaves. So now his chance of immortality is gone, ironically by a snake, just like in the story of Adam and Eve. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we get the idea of the flood story, surviving the flood. In his story, that those who survived the flood, Noah and his family, were granted immortality afterwards. And that's where this idea of the flower comes from, and Gilgamesh is trying to find that and to understand it better. And so it's a fascinating story. He comes to realize basically that the best way to have impermanence in life isn't to prevent you dying, but is to make a positive effect on other people's lives. By being charitable, by giving service to people, you do better. So when he comes back and retakes his role as king of Uruk, instead of being a despotic king like he was before, thinking that everything should be about him, he realizes that his best way of gaining immortality is having the people remember him as a good king. So taking care of his people became the thing he did. He became a more benevolent king at the time, at least according to the epic. What really happened in reality could be a whole different story. Now, what's interesting about this Epic of Gilgamesh is it is older than the currently known documents we have of the Old Testament. So some scholars look at this and go, well, this goes back way before we have any writings of the Noah flood story and Adam and Eve and everything else. So just because the writings we have of the ancient Hebrew that we got the Old Testament from don't date that far back. They get back to like the intermediary period in between the Old and New Testament time frame, and not much further than that. We don't have records that go back further than that, at least yet. Hopefully, we'll find some. But the Epic of Gilgamesh goes back to like the 800s or 900s, I think, BC, or even further back than that. So it's a much older tradition. So if we look at it, maybe that's where so some scholars look at this and go, maybe ancient Israel got these stories from a Mesopotamian epic and wrote their own history from it. Now that is a perspective. That is a perspective. I'm not saying it's a right perspective or a wrong perspective. It's just a perspective. If you read the Old Testament, it assumes that there were ancient documents that were used, that were kept, that traditionally Moses is the one that wrote a lot of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which was way before the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there's an argument to be made either way on that, basically. So it's just interesting that there's another version of that idea. And sometimes people put more weight on the Epic of Gilgamesh than the Old Testament stories. And that's their prerogative as scholars. You can choose, which one you want to believe as well. But it's fascinating. There are other stories about the floods and these stories that are out there also. So it's kind of a fun thing to look at. So we're going to get into, in the next few weeks, more about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and those people as well as we continue on in that class. My History 3000 class, basically the history, how to be a historian class, I guess is lack of a better term. In there, we talked about there's different kinds of history. We talked last week about oral history, that there's a lot of history out there that's not written down that still has some validity. A lot of Native American traditions are oral traditions. They're not written down, they're handed down by generation to generation. And so it's important that we preserve those because sometimes oral tradition changes over time. And so we want to, if you write it down, it doesn't change as fast. It still can change, but not as often. So in this week, we learned about what's called material history or material culture. And what this is looking at objects. What can objects tell us about that time of history? So we look at an object. What is the object made of? How was the object produced? Was it carved from a rock? Can we date the rock, do some carbon dating from that rock to see how old the rock was? Can we see where did that rock come from? Is it a regional type of rock? What can we learn from it? In fact, what's fascinating about material history is, especially when you get into pottery, the type of pottery, sometimes the material used for the pottery can determine where it was made. What's fascinating is in a lot of clay, we have a a material called magnetite. It's a naturally magnetized element. And so this is a type of rock that occurs naturally, magnetite, and usually not in big chunks, but in lots of little small chunks. And it happens in like clay type soils. And so magnetite naturally aligns itself up with magnetite comes from um, lava rock, basically. And so it's this metamorphosed type rock, basically. And so, and correct me if I'm wrong again, geologists on this, but it aligns itself with the polarity of the Earth's magnetism, like a compass does. So what's fascinating is when you have magnetite in the clay and you fire it, the magnetite gets so hot it becomes malleable as the clay is being fired and dried out and heated up that it changes. So when the clay it erases the magnetism of the magnetite in the clay. So when the clay cools down into the hardened pottery, the magnetite realigns itself with the magnetic pole of the Earth, which means because there's different declinations of those, you can look at the different degrees of magnetism as it goes around the Earth. Because of that, you can say this pot was made in this location because of where else in the Earth is that magnetic declination. So it's kind of cool that you can actually date like locations by this. It's kind of fun. But what was it made? Why was it made? How was it used? How was it perceived? Sometimes people put a lot of credibility into the abundance of statues of women. There's lots of statues that we have from antiquity of a female figure, basically. A lot of scholars look at this and say this must point to an abundance of goddess worship. These are statues of goddesses, and they were worshiping goddesses more than gods, so more of a female god than a male god. And the prevalence of these is an example of goddess worship. Other scholars look at this and go, that could be true, but this also could be some guy made a bunch of statues of naked women for pornographic reasons and sold them to other men. And it's like, oh, okay, that's not an easily provable analogy, but it is a possible theoretical one. So looking at material gives us an ideas of history. We can look at the things around us. Think of when you look at material history, it's kind of like the old idea of Sherlock Holmes, deduction, deductive reasoning, or looking at a crime scene. What is in the crime scene? What's going on? What can we learn about this time period from the things that we find? Okay, and we see these, we can date tools. Oh, this tool comes from a jawbone of an animal, and this carbon dates to this time period. So this was the animal had to have died before they made the tool, so it was in this relative time frame that they made it. Now we can't be 100% perfect on it, especially in ancient history, but we can get close. We can make some assumptions and ideas of what does that mean. Another way to look at this is visual history. What were images? What were paintings that were depicted? That can tell us and inform us of things that they believed or things that were valuable back then. In a lot of my history classes, we've used the popular painting, especially my more early American type studies of Manifest Destiny. If you go to Google and type in Manifest Destiny picture, you'll see this picture come up of a place going from plains to mountains, of a railroad, of telegraph lines, people on wagons, people on trains, people on horses, riding across the plains towards the mountains, and a large picture of a woman, an angel, carrying a book and carrying the telegraph lines with her as they go in this westerly direction. And this is kind of a visual depiction of manifest destiny. There's a lot of fun you can learn about what does this mean, how do we apply this and understand what the people in the 1800s thought in America based on that painting. So looking at the pictures that we have can tell us about the culture and society. Even in Pompeii, they've been able to find pictures, pictures that were put on the walls of some of the buildings, pictures that were actually hung on walls that were preserved in the destruction of Pompeii. And they're using these pictures to get an idea of what was done in this room, how was this depicted, what kind of a building was this. and they can use those pictures to make some analogies. So history isn't just about text. History is about all the things that were happening that we can find. If we find certain types of pots or certain types of tools, this is why we think of the term the Bronze Age as a common one. Why do we talk about the Bronze Age? Because in that time of history, we see a lot of weapons and tools suddenly become bronze, which is brass, basically. So it's an amalgam of metals. So before then, they had more, solid metals like the Iron Age. They had iron. They knew how to do like cast iron type ideas. A lot of stuff was out of iron. It was heavy, it was rigid, and brittle. But then they started to mix copper into it and other things, and they created bronze, which offered a softer metal but more malleable in using it, but was still really strong and hard when it was done, cooling down and things. But it was easier to use. It held a blade better than iron. It didn't rust as fast as iron, and those kinds of things. And steel comes from mixing some of these metals together the later. So that's what they call these like the Bronze Age, is they start to see an abundance of bronze being used. So someone figured it out, and eventually it caught on across the whole culture, and they used it. And so that's looking at material from a historical perspective. So one of the things we did in this class, to give you an example of this, is we had to pick an article. I picked an article about masculinity in World War II. In this article, the article itself talked about how during the beginning of World War II, they really pushed a huge narrative in America to encourage men to sign up to go to war, was that it was the masculine thing to do. If you're a real man, you're going to sign up and go fight the war. And they depicted pictures of men, strong, strapping men, big muscles, their sleeves are rolled up, showing that they're not afraid of hard work, out there fighting in warfare, doing things. So that was the enlistment posters, was to depict the idea of a manly man signs up for the Army or the Marines or whatever. Well, this kind of ran into a bit of a problem for the State Department and the War Department, because if all the men went to war, who grows the crops to feed the soldiers to keep them alive and healthy so they can fight the war? So they went, wait a minute here, we're ruining the back end support of our war effort by getting all the men to go. So they had to change their posters, and they started to make posters about how manly it was and just as patriotic to be a farmer as it was to be a soldier. And so they changed the posters. They used different posters to talk about getting into the war. In fact, one of the posters that was in this article that I read was showing a picture of Marines coming off the beach. So they're running inland off the beach, and the Marine in front holding his rifle as if he's about to run his bayonet into the enemy. So they're coming into close combat with the enemy, hand-to-hand fighting type closeness. He's not aiming his gun to shoot. He's holding it like he's going to stab somebody with the bayonet part. So very close combat, very intense part of the fighting. And it says in the caption that we need you to plant more beets so that we can give them more sugar to fuel the war. They need calories, basically. Sugar is basically calories. Most people think about it that way. And it technically is calories, but modern science is a little bit different, but that's a whole other story. They looked at it as a calorie, the whole calorie balance type concept. The soldiers need calories. Sugar beets are a great way to get sugar, where we can feed those calories to the men so they can actually fight. If we don't have sugar beets, the men can't have the energy to fight, which means we lose. So they started to use these visual ideas to show, hey guys, farmers are just as important to the war effort as soldiers. You can be a manly man and stay home and work on the farm just as much as enlist in the army. In fact, when they did, they started to actually change the enlistment requirements so that they would actually keep some men behind to run the farms. If they left all the women behind, the women were already going into manufacturing plants to take over jobs of making cars and ammunition and other stuff in the manufacturing plants, because there was so many men went to fight the war, women had to pick up the manufacturing jobs. That was Rosie the Riveter time frame, those kinds of situations. And then women were doing farm work too, but farm's hard. Farm work is really hard, and Men are naturally stronger than women typically, and so it'd be easier for men to get that hard work done while the women were taking care of the younger kids and the family and domestic stuff. You couldn't have the women doing domestic stuff and the farm. It just wouldn't. It doesn't work. It's overwhelming. So they tried to portray the farmer as just as equal as the soldier by using these visual aids. And so that's a visual history of masculinity in World War II. In the article, it says they got a lot of people to agree with it, that they needed farmers, and they had posters that said, "Get your farm in the fight." You're part of the front lines effort just as much as the soldier is, to educate the farmers to stay and educate the men who were working on a farm to stay. You can be just as important to the war effort at home, providing food for the soldiers, as you could going off into Europe to fight. So that was a visual study. We had to write a report based not on the article we read, but on the visuals they included in the article. And so that's my report was based on those recruitment posters that they were using. So that's another way to look at history, is the visual aspect. What can we see? What was left over? What does this inform us about that time? How was these items used at that time? That can make a difference in how we think about history. Sometimes artifacts can be brought into a history class today, and kids don't even know what it is. Did you know at one point there used to be an item called a glove stretcher? It looked kind of like chopsticks with a spring in the middle, and when you push the end, the other end opened up really wide. So you push the short end, the long end opened up. Leather gloves were very common in the 17, 1800s and early 1900s. And so the problem is that when they get wet, leather shrinks and they don't work as well. And so somebody invented this tool that you stick in your glove, in the finger part of your glove, and you push down on the short end, which gives you lever along, like a lever along the long end, and you stretch that leather out to make it so you can fit your glove again. You can keep it from shrinking in size. Too bad that's a terrible joke. Too bad the prosecution didn't use a glove stretcher on O.J. Simpson's gloves before they had him try him on for the trial. Sorry, terrible analogy from the 1990s, but that was the thing they used to have. Today we don't have that anymore because our gloves are synthetic now. So it's just interesting how that works out. Now, another thing we talked about in the idea of material culture, material history, was movies. We read an article from a teacher. When they teach their students about history, they actually have their kids watch movies that depict certain time periods. And that helps them to understand and educate about history. Now, some movies are made about historical events. We could look at, the most obvious is Schindler's List. If you want to understand what was the Holocaust like, that is a heck of a movie to watch to understand what was it like to deal with the Holocaust. There's other related movies like the Boy Who Wore Pajamas and other things like that that are similar as well. So those are movies made about historical events. Another way to look at this is more pop culture movies, and what can that inform us of those days and age. If you want to understand pre-depressionary times, watch things like It's a Wonderful Life. It's a Wonderful Life depicts someone who's a man who is trying to start a savings and loan. We think, what is a savings and loan? Back in the early 1900s, there was the idea of a bank, but then there was this idea of a savings and loan, which is a little bit more like our credit union today. They're not a full bank. They're meant to be a little bit more local and adaptable and nimble to the financial needs of the people, instead of big and stodgy like a bank would be. And the problem is they collapsed when the Great Depression happened. The Rickenbacker Company messed up their stock and tried to be manipulative. It caused the market to just trickle down. Everybody ran to savings and loan and try to pull their money out. And the problem is just like a bank, this is the problem. When you put $100 in the bank, they take that $100 and they loan it out to 10 people. So they've now extended credit of $1,000 to people who then pay it back with interest. If you go back and ask for your $100 back, hopefully they have enough reserve currency to cover the deposits that are coming in and the demands of their people taking money out. A run on a bank is when everybody goes back to the bank and tries to take all their money out, which is impossible because the bank doesn't hold your money and sit on it. The bank takes your money and gives it to other people, lends it to them as debt, and then collects the interest, which allows the bank to make money and you to make an interest on your money as well. So realize when you put money in a savings account, you're giving money, even in your checking account too, you're giving money to the bank so they can lend it to other people. Okay, you're providing an asset to them, which is why they give you a very meager, small percentage back. If you borrow money from the bank, you're going on the other side of that coin, basically borrowing somebody else's money to do stuff for you. So these savings and loans crash. That's what the whole movie's about. This guy tries to be kind and nice and help people. They see him as a bad man. He loses his house. He almost loses his family. It's terrible. The angel has to come and kind of help him think through it. He's depressed, and then it's all wonderful at the end. It all saves, and everybody's happy. It's a Wonderful Life. You could look at some of the Buster Keaton movies, The General and others are from that time, the silent movies. If you want to see what life was like during the Depression, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was a piece made around that time. It's a kind of a cult classic in our day, but it was made about the time frame. Even though Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was based on the historical writings of ancient Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey type stories. They modernized the analogy for our day and age, but set it in the time frame of the 1930s, which was during the Great Depression. Little Orphan Annie, Oliver, those are plays and movies you can watch that are about the time of the Great Depression. So those can give you insight, a visual history, even though it's not a documentary, it still gives us information of what life was like. What was it like to be an orphan in New York? Go watch Oliver or Annie. A female or a male orphan. They had different stories. They lived in orphanages. They had to work. They had to fight to get what they wanted. It was a terrible time. So that's what happens, basically. So we can look at these as timepieces. If you want to understand the 1970s, there's quite a few movies you could look at to help you understand the 1970s, but one of them that should be on your list is Smokey and the Bandit. If you want to understand the 1970s, that's an important one because it's so iconic to the themes and ideas of the 1970s that was there. So that's what we talk about with movies, is you watch these movies and they can give you insight into what is it like to live in that day and age. We can even look at the movies Back to the Future. Number one, when they go back to 1955, they're depicting what was life like in 1955. If somebody with a 1985 mentality went back to 1955, what would that have been like? So just in the interesting battles and contradictions and things, that happen with that. So sometimes movies can teach us about history and inform us about the culture and trends in history as well. So history, again, isn't just what's written down. It's all the things we can learn about a time period and people that can help us to better understand and gain perspective of what did happen. So I hope you enjoy this update and these lessons and things. If you have comments or questions, put them down there. What are things you're learning? What are things that you've really enjoyed from these updates I do on the weekends? Just kind of like to see, how are you using this? What is this? How have you found this helpful? So look forward to that, and we'll see you next week for the next one.